So, my name is Liam Esler. I'm the Managing Director of Summerfall Studios here in Melbourne. And I have to tell you that this talk was written fairly last minute as a replacement talk for another talk. But this is stuff that I know like the back of my hand. So the slides are not top notch. The content is decently fine. So, growing your company can sometimes unintentionally involve sacrificing it to those eldritch game dev gods, as we have seen many times throughout repeated history in Australia and beyond. I say, fuck that, actually. Over the past 12 months, Summerfall's grown from like 8 people to 18 people, and we plan to grow much bigger over the next few years. We're not alone. Obviously, with the DGTO coming in, other tax incentives on a state level, Australia is going to continue to be a hub for game development. And teams like ours, and probably some of you, are going to want to expand. You know, it's an exciting time. We're all in growth stages or starting to plan what growth looks like. And Summerfall is a company that was planned deeply intentionally from the outset. Before I ever sort of started talking to David Gator or Ellie Young, my co-founders, I did a little sort of trip around Australia and talked to all of the game developers that I knew who were way fucking smarter than me and had way more experience than me, and basically was like, please, tell me what you did wrong so that I can learn. And then, by the way, can you check out this pitch and then tear it apart? And it was probably the most useful thing I could have possibly done. And it is in that spirit that Summerfall was founded. And as we've continued, I've tried to continue that spirit by every time we start to hit a new stage or we start to explore a new problem space, I go around to all the people who are much more smart than me, who are much more experienced than me, and say, what the fuck am I doing? What do I do? So this talk is sort of the result of that. It's also an ongoing conversation about sustainability, which feels very topical for this conference in particular. Over the past couple of years, I've had a lot of conversations with game developers in Australia and all over the world about sustainability and sustainable growth and what making sustainable video games looks like. What to do, what to avoid. In this talk, my goal is to pass some of that learning on to you and to examine some of the inevitable issues that kind of result as a part of that growth. I don't want this talk to be a negative one. We are going to touch on some negative themes, and it's going to end on a bit of a downer, but I promise it'll be worth it. So, what is a vision for the Australian industry's growth? How do you as a company sort of want that growth to happen? What is it going to be at the expense of? And I do want to highlight, again, that I'm learning all this stuff as I go. I'm not an expert. And that's not to say that I have imposter syndrome in this area. I don't. I'm just acknowledging that there are people who are way better than me at this and way smarter, who I've stolen this wholesale from. So thanks, gang. Credit this talk to 100 different developers across AUNZ, the US, Canada, Europe. If you disagree with something, though, please blame me. It's probably one of my things. The bad bits are usually me. I want you to leave this talk with some frameworks of thinking, some things to go and explore and learn about. You shouldn't take any part of this talk, nor any talk that you hear at any conference wholesale. Please filter it through the lens of your own experience. My experience running Summerfall is violently different to your experience with your studios and your workplaces. But I hope it inspires you to think about some of these topics, and most importantly, think intentionally and critically about your strategy and planning. Now, I'm going to use language that makes it seem like I know what I'm doing. Again, I don't. Nobody does. Anybody who says they does is a fucking liar. By acknowledging that we don't know what we're doing, we open ourselves up to the reality that we've got everything to learn and that that's a good thing. It's really important to be stupid. It's a good thing. And the question that I want to examine broadly is like, are we designing our teams as intentionally as we design our games? This is going to be the structure of the talk roughly. I want to talk about business strategy and how that leads into talent strategy, and then sort of studio support strategy. Hiring isn't just about what skills you need for your current project. It's not just about the current disaster that you face. It's got to involve your long-term business strategy. And I know that seems like a really intimidating thing, and a lot of people don't know what a business strategy is or should look like. Me either. Business strategy is different for every company. It's something that you're going to iterate on over time, but it is something that you need to think about early. However you build it, it's got to have a really clear objective or objectives with really clearly identified pathways towards those objectives. Think SMART, and by SMART, I specifically mean specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Good goals should always be SMART. This is one framework for thinking about goal setting. It's a very, very useful one. I encourage you to explore it if this is a new concept to you. But go research SMART if you've never heard of it. It's very useful. So we're going to start at the beginning. This is not a business strategy talk because, baby, that ain't me. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about when it comes to business strategy. I didn't go to business school. If you want to, you should go and talk to people who know this shit like the back of their hand. But there are some key things to consider. What is your competitive advantage? And what is your operational advantage? And I'm realizing that none of my speaker notes are here, and that's really fun for me. I'm going to get them up on my phone, I think. No, actually, I'm going to get them up on my laptop. Sorry, gang. I was like, interesting. Something's missing. All right. Oh, it's because it's offline. Interesting. Why is it doing that? Anyway, so who's familiar with the idea of sort of operational strategy, and who's idea with the idea of competitive strategy? There's a couple of hands. Excellent. That's thrilling to me. A lot of people aren't. So, all right. Basically, it's about being better than other people. Well, sort of. These can be defined very, very differently, and often are. And if you're interested, you should go and do the business degree that I never did. So I'm just going to apply my own very simple definitions to these for the purposes of this talk. This is what I find useful. It's not necessarily how someone who's actually educated might explain them. Competitive advantage. So put yourself in comparison to other companies. What's unique and special about what you make? What gives your products an advantage over the businesses in your space? Competitive advantage is something that you build. It's about what you make. It's a strategic choice. Ultimately, competitive advantage is like talent, it's your unique skill sets, etc. Operational advantage is how do you do what you do more efficiently than other businesses? How you make what you make. And this is like tooling, process, etc. I promise it's going to get less boring than this. It really depends on your goals, but particularly for things like an acquisition, if that's your goal as a studio, these concepts are really, really useful to think about. So let's say you're working towards getting acquired. That's just one of many potential goals for a business. Do you know what you need to be as a business in order for that to happen? What's valuable to a potential buyer? Like, you need to do your research. Every single type of company that acquires other companies is looking for different things. Your long-term goal could be any number, but it should guide all decision-making at this level for your product and your people. So if you've done your research and you know what a buyer wants, like what is valuable? Common things are like intellectual property, so like what your game is, process, talent, tooling. There are lots and lots of others. Those are just a couple. But again, this should guide decision-making. It's a North Star. It's a thing that you always come back to. But let's say instead you want to grow, and it's just like a sustainable like lifestyle business is what they call it. And you don't want to grow hugely, just a little bit. and you want to self-publish. You don't want to work with a publisher because that's a pretty inequitable relationship. Maybe you want to be hitting, let's say, like 1.5 to 2 million in revenue per year. Think through, like, okay, that's my goal. That's my long-term goal. I want to hit that in the next 8 to 10 years, hopefully sooner. How do I get there? What are the things that I need to do in order to make that happen? And like for that goal, it's likely publishing expertise. It's marketing, release management, quality assurance, all the things that a publisher would normally do. Business strategy doesn't need to be complicated. Like our biz strategy is like a page. It doesn't need reams of documentation. It doesn't need complex forecasting or business intel. Business intel helps. All of this can be very helpful, but at the end of the day, it's just about having a goal and creating pathways to those goals. And the reality is you need a business strategy. You need a goal because it's really going to affect how you hire and what your talent pipeline looks like and what those people do and what order you hire them in, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to talk a little bit about talent strategy. The thing that I think that a lot of people don't talk about or think about when we're talking about talent strategy is like your talent strategy begins with you and your founding team because you set the tone, you set the bar. All behavior comes from you. People look to you to see what they should be doing and how they should be behaving. You become the basis for all preferred and acceptable behavior at your company. And that's true of your founding team as well. So your first few hires are critical because, everyone's going to look at them and be like, well, that's how people are expected to work at this company. So if you've got an early team member who's really passive aggressive, who isn't good with conflict, people are going to look to that person and be like, okay, well, we don't have arguments here. We don't do arguments. And they're going to see that the response to this, okay, well, the acceptable behavior here is passive aggression. That's how we communicate. That's what the leads are doing. So I'm going to replicate that behavior. And I want to talk about this idea of the shadow self. I fully stole this from a business coach on the Startup podcast. And it is a concept that has proved very, very useful to me in Summerfall's sort of journey and in my own career. But basically, the idea of the shadow self is all of your negative coping mechanisms, all the things you learned in childhood to protect you, often don't really help as an adult. They become negative. They become damaging, especially to yourself and the people around you. And if you don't deal with those mechanisms, if you don't deal with those behaviors, your company is probably going to replicate them. Your company is going to become those behaviors. So if you're the one who doesn't like conflict, if you're the one who avoids healthy arguments, if you don't learn how to do that, nobody in your company is going to feel comfortable doing that. Nobody's going to have arguments. Nobody's going to have healthy disagreement. And if you're not modeling what healthy disagreement looks like and healthy argument, then they're not going to know how to do that. And they're going to think that that's not okay. That's how you get cultures of toxic positivity, where nobody wants to give feedback to one another. And then that becomes this like massive current of passive aggression. And on the surface, everything looks really happy and great, but you start to dig in and everyone's miserable because nobody's giving them feedback. Nobody's telling them how to improve. They don't see any prospects. The product isn't getting better. The game sucks. But on the surface, everything's happy. And that's a great example of sort of how that shadow self concept works. It's something that I've found very, very helpful. The other thing to keep in mind is that who feels comfortable applying to work with you depends on what your current team looks like. If you want a diverse team, you need to have a diverse founding team, or at least make your executive and key hires representative of the kind of team that you want to hire. And I think that often gets lost in a lot of these conversations about sort of hiring people who don't look like you. If you don't have a woman on your team, being the first woman on a team is a really difficult thing. There's a huge cultural shift. And as men, we don't recognize that at all. Like I've spoken to many women about this specific problem, and it's the same for people who are non-binary. It's the same for people who aren't white. Every sort of like neurodiversity, et cetera, like being the first person is a really, really difficult thing. And so if you have a founding team that covers a broad range of experience and life experience, it makes people feel more comfortable to apply. If you're already a founding team that's pretty monocultured, it definitely makes things harder, you know? It means you need to think about your leadership hires and those early hires very carefully and work harder. And I want to introduce you to another idea called diversity debt. So I assume everyone knows what technical debt is? Yes, cool. Okay, apply the same thinking to diversity in a company. So with every hire that you make that's another person that looks just like you accrue diversity debt. And that diversity debt continues to grow and gather interest. It makes, with every subsequent hire, it makes it harder to hire somebody who doesn't look like you because they're not going to feel comfortable working for you. They're not going to feel comfortable applying because they don't see somebody who looks like them. This is a really, really useful idea and another one of those frameworks that's really helped with Summerfall's growth and I hope can help with other people as well. On top of all this, your product strategy, the kind of games you make, deeply influences who's going to apply for jobs at your studio, who wants to work with you. If you want to work with a certain kind of person, you need to consider their interest in what you're working on. Are they part of the audience for that game? Like that, then they're going to want to work on it if they are. If they're not part of the audience for the products that you're making, it's going to be hard to engage them. It's going to be hard to get them in the door even. They're not going to want to apply. So the kind of things that you make are really critical to the kinds of people who are going to work with you. All right, so how does business strategy affect growth and hiring? I know that this can sometimes be a bit of an opaque thing, so I'll try to break it down as best I can. There are lots of considerations for studio growth. You know, like what pipelines do you want to develop? What tools? What projects do you want to create in the future? What's your project pipeline look like? What skills do you have now? What skills do you need to develop to create those projects? How do you make games? What is your production process? What are your frameworks for production? What structure do you plan to use as you grow for your teams? These are all things that come from a good business strategy. So at Summerfall, you know, we have like a 3-product strategy. We have an idea of the third game that we want to make, and it's a big one. And every decision that we make is drawn back from that game. It's about, okay, we know that it needs to be fully 3D, which means we need like 3D environments. We need to make sure that we have a really great animation pipeline. We want to make sure we have FCAP and mocap, a really robust VO pipeline. It means that we need a really strong design department. All of these things are things that I know now and affect how we think about growing the studio. Stray Gods was all about building tooling. It was all about building dialogue tooling because dialogue's going to be at the core of all of Summerfall's games, right? So we wanted to make sure that for our first game, we picked a really key part of the pipeline that we're going to need for the third game that we make and build it out that way. There are lots of considerations for when we think about hiring that we should play with as well. Who's heard of culture add rather than culture fit? Great, we've got some people in the audience. So I'm a big fan of this concept. And for those who don't know what it is, culture fit is the idea that you want to hire for somebody who fits in. What that normally means when translated is you want to hire someone who looks like you, who has your experience, who's similar to you. That's pretty antithetical to the idea of hiring a team of people who have lots of different experiences and who can contribute to a richer culture that's going to create better products. Culture fit tends to not work the way that tech used to want it to work, and so the conversation has really moved on from that point. But we in games haven't really addressed a lot of these ideas yet. We're still a little bit behind. And so the idea of culture add is about, we want to find people who add to the richness of our cultures at our studios, who add skills, backgrounds, experience, life experience. All of that is valuable in the creative process. It helps us address problems before they come up after launch, especially if you're creating products for an audience that you're a part of but not the sole person of, which is everybody. You want to make sure that your team has a diverse amount of people in it who are in that audience, who can speak to the issues that that audience is going to have. The interview process is also a reflection of what working for you is going to be like. It's the first exposure that someone gets to your studio. It's critical to the future of your company and should be very carefully thought about and designed, just like you design your games. I think that people often get stuck in the rut of, oh shit, we need to hire up. We have this pipeline, we need 3 people, we just need to get them in the door. So we're just gonna put out a job ad and then we're gonna interview and then we're gonna hire the best person. The reality is that for a candidate, that pipeline sucks. And to be honest, the interviewing pipeline is it's awful. It's such a terrible way to hire people. Unfortunately, it's also the best one there is. So we should really carefully plan and think about what that looks like from a candidate's perspective. Think about it from their experience, like we would think about a player's experience playing a game. Plan the experience of interviewing from the applicant's perspective. Give them all of the information. Tell them the process up front. Don't waste their time. Pay for tests. Reflect the values of your studio and your own personal values in your interviewing process so that your candidates see that you're serious about those things, because you should be. At Summerfall, we try to do this with varying degrees of success. It's always really hard, and I totally recognize that it is hard for everybody. But part of that is when somebody applies, once we've got a good group of people, we send out a bulk email that's like, this is what the hiring process at Summerfall looks like. Here is, for the last public roles that we had, it was, there are 2 interviews. For some roles, there's a test. Here's what happens at each stage of the process. Here's when we're going to reach out to you if you're successful. Here's when we're going to reach out to you if you're not successful. Here's what that looks like. Here's what we expect you to prepare. One thing that I really want to do more of in the future is sending questions ahead of time, at least for half of them, because not all candidates are good on the spot. They need time to think about questions. So really think through the process, optimize it for your audience, just like we would for games. And that also means creating a sense of psychological safety in the interview process, because that's what we want in our workplaces. We know that statistically speaking, scientifically speaking, psychological safety is what creates the best products. It's the best teams. It allows us to create a common language, and that gives us the best chance of success in an insane industry where what we do is wildly complicated and difficult. And I just said 2 words that mean the same thing. Take the time to get to know a candidate in an interview. Don't just have a set of questions that you robotically go through. I know that that's a lot easier. It's not a corporate recitation of facts. A lot of interviews are more about a vibe check. And you want to plan it in that way. The way that we like to do it is we do the vibe check interview first. And that's hey, are you a serial killer? What's going on? What's this whole situation about? What's going on? Tell us about yourself. Let's have a conversation. What are you going to add to us? And then we do a technical interview second, where we sometimes will get them to do a paid written test, or for our cinematic candidates, we often get them to create a scene in Unreal using Sequencer, because that's the tool that they're going to use. And usually we know that they've never used it before, and that's actually the test. It's basically to be hey, pick up a piece of software that you've never used before and problem solve using it. We know you can do it. What problems come up? Talk to us about those problems. We just want to know how you think, and that's why that works. But for others, we will get them to do a presentation. We'll ask them to sort of talk through something that they know really, really well. Because again, we just want to see how they think. You want it to be what working for you is like. Give them an idea and understanding of what that looks like. You also want to make sure that the right people are interviewing. So make sure that people on the team you're hiring for are the ones in the interview process. Train and support them appropriately to do that. Interviewing is a skill. It's incredibly difficult. But ultimately, the relationships that the interviewer builds with the interviewee is going to be crucial when they start. It builds trust and creates rapport and creates a framework for support. which really helps any candidate in their onboarding process. It also means that the team that this person is joining has a really clear say in who joins them. And that's often not the case as we grow. We often think that we don't have time for that. But each team has its own culture. You know, one of the things that happens as a team grows is you can't have a monoculture anymore. The team grows and it splits and shifts and evolves, and different teams have their own subcultures. And so that means that you can't just hire for your company. You're hiring for a team. Make sure that team is part of the process. Get buy-in from them. You need to be an attractive place to work as well. Like, Australia, I mean, it's already hard to hire here. Like, we've all encountered that problem. It's about to get like 50 times worse. You know, there are more and more companies coming in from overseas. You know, just in the last week, I've heard of about 300 to 350 roles that are gonna appear over the next 12 months just in Victoria. That's insane. That's terrifying. And that means that it's our job to really carefully consider what makes us a good place to work. You know, when there's so much competition, like what advantage do you have? How are you being a better workplace than those other places? What are you making? Is it interesting to the people that you want to hire? Does the audience for what you're making and the kind of people you want working for you align? Are they the same? Are they different? Think about this very, very carefully. This is where, like, if you know that you can't compete on a salary basis, like how do you compete with that? Money isn't the only thing we have, right? We have time. We have all kinds of things that we can do, and you don't have to do the same things that everyone else does. We all work in unique ways. It's okay to push that a little bit further. That means stuff like the 4-day work week, if that's something that you want to explore, which is not without its problems, let's be real, but like that is an attractive thing for a candidate. It's an attractive thing for me. Like, God, I want to work a 4-day work week. Think about leave, being flexible with leave. You know, I'm not a huge fan of unlimited leave as a concept. It doesn't tend to work out in practice very well. Depending on the studio culture, people often feel way more uncomfortable taking leave when it's not limited. I'm more of a fan of trying to get people to use it, but I'll talk about that a little later. How are you doing hiring? Are you in the right places for the people that you're trying to hire? You know, often people, I think, just kind of are like, well, we're going to put a job on Seek. We're going to post on IGDAM. We're going to post on IGEA Sydney and Brisbane and, you know, Tassie. We're going to post in all of these groups, Perth. And then we're going to put it on Sumia, and we're going to like wipe our hands and be done with it. But a lot of people aren't on those sites. A lot of people who are on those sites are dudes. A lot of those are white dudes. A lot of those are straight dudes. So if you want to hire for a diverse workforce, you need to think about where those people are. And that's the same for skills. Like if you want to hire someone who's really like, we have a lot of cinematics people, and they didn't necessarily come from games. They're coming from animation. They're coming from video editing. And so when we were hiring for those roles, I made sure that I found the spaces that those kinds of people with those skills existed, and then talked to them in their language. What about seniors, leads, mids? We call these strategic hires. They're hires that are really critical for the future of the studio. These are things that you need to plan for long term. Like, we haven't finished Stray Gods, and I'm already starting to think about the strategic hires for the next project and then the project after that, because that's something you need to start thinking about early, because chances are in Australia, we might not be able to hire those people. They're actually people we might need to grow internally, especially moving forward. So how do I make sure that the people we've got now are properly supported to become the people that the studio's gonna need? And does that align with what they want? We'll talk about this later. That's where one-on-ones come in very handy. A thing I've been thinking about when it comes to senior hires is letting them be a part of the interview design process. These are experts in their field. They're probably hired before. Like, I think it's a cool idea to be like, in the first interview, how would you run this process for the optimal result? Talk to them about that, and then integrate some of their ideas in, because that's what working for you is gonna be like. Makes it harder, but it might make the interviewing process a lot better on both sides. There's also when you should hire. There are generally two schools of thought when it comes to like when we should make hires. There's the idea of preparatory hiring, hiring before it hurts, and then hiring when it hurts. For a given situation, it could be totally different. But for every role that you foresee, you should think about which of these you need it to be. For a strategic hire, you probably want to do some preparatory hiring. You want to hire in advance. These are people who are going to be the cultural touchstones for your studio. As the rest of the team staffs up, they're going to look to this person. You want to make sure that they're really embedded, that they know what they're doing, that they reflect the kinds of people you want working for you. They need to know you. They need to know the studio. That's going to take time. So if you're thinking like, I need to build an entire team that I don't have right now, pick a couple of those roles that are really critical, hire them in advance, so that then you can start building out that pathway for the rest of the team. Sometimes it's just about hiring when it hurts. Like we've got a situation right now where we need to hire up for a specific pipeline. Right, we need to hire 3 people in the next 2 months. So like, let's do it. And that's totally fair too, but it's a conscious thing that we need to decide. It's also really critical to train and hire juniors. It's something we're not very good at as an industry still, despite the fact that we're about to have one of the biggest talent shortages this industry's ever had. How do we make it easier for them to become us? You know, our getting into the industry was wildly difficult in Australia. So how do we make it easier for the next generation of people who are going to come through? How do we support them effectively? What does it look like for a given role? There's no one-size-fits-all training, right? But make sure that it's there. Make sure that they have somebody internally who they can learn from. Also think about if a hire is the right choice for a situation. There's a term that is in AAA called fire hosing, which is the idea of like, often people think they can solve a complicated problem by throwing people at it. And I think that that's an attractive idea from an executive level. Throw money at a problem, it'll fix it, right? It can be tempting, but it's rarely effective. You know, you throw more people at a problem and usually the problem just gets more complicated. You want to be thinking about efficiency. How can you support the existing team in that case? How do you make their pipelines more efficient? How do you talk to them to make their lives better? There are some specific situations where fire hosing, hiring a bunch of people for a problem, can help. And that is when there is a really clear pipeline, when it's about execution, when there are clear standards, when there's like a really clear task pipeline. It's like, okay, we need someone who can come in and, you know, do this, do that, do that, do that, and then it's done. There's not a lot of exploration in that process. There's not a lot of discovery that needs to occur. There's not a lot of problem solving. It's, you know, going through and doing a good job. That's where hiring up can be a really good solution. But think about whether you should be doing that or whether you should be making the lives of the people who work for you easier, because that's often cheaper too. There's a business reason to be doing that. Also, keep in mind that a hire is not a full productive person. This is a very simple thing, but I'm going to repeat it because like it's easy to miss. One person added to a team is not one person added to a team. It's usually 0.5. At first, it might even be 0.3. They might get up to a 0.75 at some point, but they're never going to be a full person's worth of productivity. And that's because there's a management layer. And so their lead has less time because they have managerial duties. They have to make sure that person is okay. They have to train them. They have to review their work. So at no point is a hire a full productive person, and we need to plan that from the get-go. Otherwise, that's where crunch happens. When you don't plan for that, you know, that's when shit hits the fan. That's what we want to avoid, right? And this really leads to studio support strategy, you know. This is something that we don't often talk about. As an industry, we're becoming decently fine at getting people through the door, especially diverse people. We're really bad at retaining them and not just laying them off. So, how do we have better studio support strategies? I think thinking about this as hiring is the beginning of a pipeline. It's not an end, it's a start. It's the beginning of designing your team and designing your future. You need to think really long term about everyone who comes in and their place in the company. How do you grow people? What pathways exist within your business for those people? This is wildly difficult, especially as you grow. You're one person, maybe 3 people in a sort of an executive team. You might have 50 staff. How do you think for each of those people? And it's like, well, you can't. But that's why we have leads. That's why we do leadership training. You really need to think about what support you're giving your existing team as you're hiring. Like I said at the beginning, it's really easy to sacrifice your existing team for new hires because new hires are exciting. And that often results in things like, hey, new hires are going to get better monetary compensation because we need them. The market rate for this role is X, and that's higher than our current rate for the rest of our staff. So we're going to put it at that rate. Are you giving raises to the rest of your staff to plan for that? No, maybe you should be. And the basic building blocks of any kind of studio support structure, I believe, are one-on-ones. I hope everyone here has heard of one-on-ones and has one-on-ones, but if you haven't heard of it, it's a regular meeting between a manager and their report. Its purpose is basically to build trust and confidence, to create a communication pathway so that when shit hits the fan, because it will, there's trust. And a report can be like, hey, I'm really having a hard time with this thing. I know it's uncomfortable to talk about, but I trust you. Let's have a conversation about it. It's about creating a space to build those relationships and solve those problems. Make sure that everyone on your team is getting one-on-ones and that any key concerns or actions that need to be taken are passed on. One-on-ones need training, and every one-on-one for every team looks different. Some people have a checklist of questions that they go through. I tend to be quite casual in my one-on-ones. I usually ask a series of questions like, hey, how are you doing? I want to, how are you doing personally? How are you doing at work? How are you feeling? How's your work going? What risks do you see that you don't think that we're seeing right now? What's going on? What is the stuff that we're, as the managers, what are we not seeing? What's going on? What's going really well? These are all really critical things, and they need to be fed upwards. There needs to be a structure of support so that when you discover those issues, they're actually getting to the right place so that you can do something about them. As you expand, what training are you providing for your team? Particularly for people who you're like, okay, this person is likely to step up and become a manager someday. How are you preparing them for that? A lot of that is leading by example, making sure that you're being the kind of manager and leader that you want your staff to be, abiding by the rules that you set in place. How are you preparing people for the future, including yourself? Remember that people management as well is a unique skill set. Your best artist is not necessarily your best lead. People management is its own skill set, and you may need to bring in people to do training for that. Right now, I'm looking around trying to work out who's going to be the best leadership coach to bring in so that we can start to train some of our people who are stepping into leadership roles. We're only 17, 18 people right now, and that's important now. If you're beyond that and you haven't really found a really good provider that you trust to do training with your team, I ask you to consider why. What support infrastructure exists for when problems arise? Do you have robust policies for harassment? Is there a person or multiple people, ideally, that the team can go to? Because if it's one person, say it's me, what if I'm the person who's doing the behavior that's really negative? What if I'm the person who's shitty and I don't realize it? There needs to be someone else who's not me. And vice versa, if someone else on the management team is the sole person for reporting HR issues, what if they're the one instigating? So you need to have a couple, ideally, and it needs to be really clear and reiterated over time. Do you have really strong leave policies that encourage people to take their leave? This is my problem with unlimited leave. There's no incentive to take leave. Leave should be incentivized. We want to avoid burnout. We want to avoid the issues that come with people who are very tired all the time. I know so many people who we all get minimum 4 weeks of leave a year, who actually uses 4 weeks of leave. Hopefully most of you, but a lot of people don't. At Summerfall, we have a policy where it's basically if you have used all of your leave before the end of the year, we have a mandatory 2-week break over Christmas and New Year's. If you've used all of your leave by that point, you get those 2 weeks for free. So that's 6 weeks of leave. We're incentivizing you to use your leave. It is a really good thing to do. If you haven't used all your leave by that point, it comes out of your leave. So it's literally incentivized. It works pretty well for the most part. Generally, people get competitive about working out how they can effectively use their leave before the end of the year. What about onboarding? Onboarding almost universally sucks. Like, I've never worked at a company where the onboarding has been good, let alone fine. How do you make yours acceptable at the very least? How do you want people to enter your team? Think about a candidate's first day, first week, first month. What do you want their experience to be? Again, just think like a game designer, you know? We're trying to make sure that their experience is what we want it to be. Plan your onboarding. Make sure that it is positive for the person. It is a reflection of your studio. If your onboarding process isn't good, they're not going to have a lot of trust that the rest of their time at your studio is going to be positive. How much production support are you providing your teams? Are they supported in their roles to do their jobs? 1 producer per 20 plus people is not sufficient. It's not fair on that producer. I've been that producer. It sucks. It is not fair on the team for whom you're supporting. My general rule of thumb is like 1 producer per 7 to 10 people. And I know that I say that and some people look at me like I'm an insane person because that seems like a very small amount. But the reality is like your job as a producer is to support them. And your producers should be supporting your team. How could they possibly support 20 people? Plan the growth of your production department alongside the growth of your studio. So it's always slightly ahead because you need to ramp up with training. You know, producers need to be trained. There's a massive lack of good producers in our industry. So we need to create them. And that means you need to be ahead of the curve. And again, it means you need to have a strategy to make that happen. Think about what management structure you have and what you want to have. You need to start thinking about this really, really early because it's really fucking hard to scale management structures effectively. Team structure and communication changes violently between 10 and 20 people, 50 to 80 people, and then with 120 plus people. Oh my God, it's fully left my head what the name of the number is. Dunbar's number, thank you. I think it's like 150 people? Yeah. We can only keep 150 people in our head at a time. And so when you're working in a much larger team, we need to fundamentally change how we communicate, how we structure our management so that you don't have to deal with that amount of people. You also need to think about this from the beginning because you need to kind of plan out and test out what those structures look like as you go. Like with Stray Gods right now, we've gone from 12 to about 18. This is like a test run for when we're a much bigger studio. It's the first time that we're jumping from like, hey, we can all get in a one-on-one at the same time. We can all be in sort of our meetings together. Suddenly, that's really difficult. Like we have, like including contractors sometimes, we could have like 20 people in a stand-up or 20 people in sprint planning. And that's really difficult to manage. It's unsustainable. It means people are sitting there bored. So like we're just about to split the team for the first time and that's terrifying. But it gives us the opportunity to test how we're gonna do that when we're bigger, find out what works and what doesn't. We have a staff who are brilliant, who are going to tell us where the pain points are, where the issues are, so that then, as we grow, we can correct for them, ideally ahead of the curve. And again, that's where one-on-ones come in really handy, and also retrospectives. If you're not doing those, you should be. Think about money. You need to plan raises, title bumps, promotions. What does your remuneration scheme look like? Have you planned it? Have you planned it over time? It is very easy to miss this, especially as a small growing studio. We all have the mindset that we're tiny and we can't afford it. And that's a joke because we've got enough money to make a game, right? So shouldn't we be supporting the people who we're working with? And you might not be able to give raises like every year if you're really small. You may not be able to think about big raises, but it's really important to have something and to talk to your team about what they expect. You want to create an environment where people come to you and they're like, hey, I need to have a chat with you about remuneration. Like, that's really important. You want to create that trust. That's what one-on-ones are really good for. One-on-ones. Do them. I already talked about this, but leave policies. How do you get people to use it? It's a huge risk, actually. Like, not only from a people perspective, from a business perspective. If you have like a ton of leave built up for people, you have to pay that out when they leave. As a small studio, like, that's really scary. Even as a bigger studio, that can be a huge liability. Encourage people to use their leave. Think about the bus problem too. Like, part of supporting your team, and this is probably one of the more difficult things that we deal with at Summerfall, because we have a lot of people who have specific skill sets and we're still pretty small. A part of support is allowing people to take leave and be sick and not feel bad about that. It's really hard, but as you're thinking through your hiring strategy, your support strategy, and your business strategy, are there any ways that you can create space for people to be ill? Plan that in. Can you create space for people to leave? People are gonna leave. You need to be able to cope with that as a team. It's a normal, natural thing. Like, my ideal goal for Summerfall is that somebody comes and tells me when they're ready to go, so that then I can actually help them to get a good job and go in the direction that they want to go. I can give them a recommendation. I can help them get into the places that they want to get into. It shouldn't be a negative thing. It should be a positive thing. The other kind of thing to think in, I'm getting towards the end, I promise. As leaders, our job is to become obsolete. Train your people, don't step in and fix problems. This is something I'm very bad at, I'm trying to get better at. Let them do their jobs, especially as you grow. It's not sustainable for leaders to step in and fix problems all the time, because it doesn't allow people to learn how to do that. And you're going to shoot yourself in the foot, and you're going to make everyone's life harder. It's really hard, but it is critically important. I hope I get better at it. Talk to people who are smarter than you. Talk to your team. Communicate one-on-ones. My final point, and this one is it's depressing. It's really depressing. I'm sorry. I'm not talking about launch, though that is really hard. You need an unbiased indicator for when to have difficult conversations. For example, what is the minimum amount of money you need to lay off the team and wrap up the company operationally in a sane and ethical way? Do you know what that number is? You should. You should never be in a position where you have less than that amount of money in the bank without knowing exactly when that situation is going to improve, e.g. a milestone payment locked in for a certain date that has been confirmed. It is deeply irresponsible and unethical to not think about these things. Shutting down a company or a project responsibly is expensive, and it is not when you run out of money. It needs to happen before then, and you need to know what that looks like for you. You need to have a plan for it, because it might happen. This is a really difficult industry. It's a thing you need to plan for, and it sucks, but as responsible leaders, this is the kind of thing that we need to think about. On that bright, exciting note, there we go. Hiring is much more than just hiring, it's business strategy. It requires studio support strategies. It requires long-term thinking. It requires learning. It requires acting like an idiot so that you can be better. You need to have a strategy. You need to be flexible, but have a goal, a North Star, and align everything towards that goal. It's going to make all of your decisions as you grow much easier. It'll help you avoid distractions, and it will empower you and your team. You and your team reflect the kinds of people who will want to apply for roles at your studio. Remember that. Don't abandon your staff after you hire them. Ensure there's adequate support and structures that are going to catch and communicate risks to you as or before, ideally, they become issues. Your staff are your company. They are what is important. They're more important than the things that you make. Without them, you have fucking nothing. so treat them as such. Thank you very much.